First, a little size comparison. One minifigure, one normal-ish LEGO Technic car, and the largest rim LEGO make for their 1/10 scale supercars. And Monstermax, just a little bit bigger. Now, originally, it was meant to look a lot more like Monstermax 2. I even went so far as to build this ridiculous double rack and pinion suspension system. Interesting, but ridiculous. However, Monstermax 2 has a very large steering offset, which wouldn't translate well into LEGO. And I thought, well, if I'm going to change that, why don't I try and make it more like a theoretical Monstermax 3? So the axles are wider, and the entire truck is longer. Then I thought, if it wasn't going to be a direct replica of something, why not make it as ridiculous as possible within some limits of LEGO? Now, these axles aren't your normal 5 to 10 that you'd find in a normal truck or car. They aren't even at 20 to 30 that you might find in large earth-moving equipment. These axles are over 120 to 1. Of course, in real life, you could just make gears bigger and not need this much reduction, but in LEGO, this does have some utility. Working back from contact, first we have the tyre and rim. The tyre is from a HPI Bullet, which is nice and soft, and the rim has been 3D printed to accommodate it and a bearing surface. The wheels are held on by a metric nut that just so happens to thread perfectly onto a LEGO axle. Behind the wheel, we found this, which is in fact not a standard LEGO piece. Now, this annoyed a great deal of people when LEGO brought this out because nice ring gear, no cross in the centre, but it had all these strange protrusions that seemed to have no function and just made it big. So I just put it in the lathe, faced off both sides, and now a very practical ring gear. Behind the ring gear, we have 4 pseudo-sun gears. This is not a planetary system. They are rigid, and only 2 are driven, but it kind of acts like the whole wheel bearing assembly. And behind that, we have another reduction, which takes the drive from the outside gears to the centre through the universal joint. Now also, we have these rollers. These rollers fit perfectly inside the 3D printed wheel and offer a nice, tight wheel bearing, which LEGO kind of struggles with. The drive then comes through this constant velocity, not quite the same thing, through this. Now this is actually a LEGO planetary gear hub, designed to be used inside the wheel, but as you can see here, it's mounted rigidly inside the axle itself. So in essence, this part here is a good LEGO axle, but it has a bit extra added onto the end. In the middle, we have the differential, and the diff lock, in order to keep the thing nice and narrow, is actually a secondary shaft driven by this gear. The steering is driven by a Control Plus motor for encoding and self-centering, and is actuated by this linear actuator. Now this linear actuator tends to have always has a clutch inside it, which is really weak, and it's not actually there to protect the actuator, it's to stop you breaking LEGO surrounding it. And because this is so big and heavy, I've taken it apart, glued the clutch together, and glued it back together, and it works really well now. And the steering arms itself kind of goes along this U shape, which isn't the best for stiffness, but keeps it nice and narrow. For strength, the axle is attached by a double triangulated 4-link system. It's still not anywhere near stiff enough as it needs to be, but for LEGO it's as good as you're going to get. And in the middle, we see a chain. This chain drives yet another 2 planetary hubs, but in reverse. And that's because there's so much reduction in the axles that it'd just be glacial. So, in order to speed it up, and efficiently, there are these planet gears driven backwards by a track cog. And this chain used to be LEGO track, but I put it in the milling machine, machined all the faces off, and now we have a nice, practical, strong LEGO chain. And at the top we find the motors, driving this chain via a normal tank track cog. Now these motors, they may look like medium motors, and maybe the cases are. The internals, somewhat different. These produce roughly 20 times the power of LEGO motors. Haven't broken them once. Wonder how long that lasts. To allow for the huge amount of articulation, almost 90 degrees when you count both axles, it has pushrod suspension. It also has an anti-roll bar running through here. This little red piece here. Now, it's not stiff enough to stop it articulating, but it keeps it nice and level when driving around. Looks less derpy. Powering the truck are two Buies 3.0 units, mounted nice and low to keep the centre of gravity low. When pulling on the drawbar, it may have had a little accident. You'll notice in the video it goes to 24 pounds and then drops back down. That wasn't it slipping. That was there was so much force pulling the front axle, it pulled the rods completely out. Didn't break them, but there's a lot of stress marks. And if you look at the underside of the rods, don't know how well it shows up on camera, there are stress marks just from the tension the axle was producing. To put that in perspective, this truck weighs just over 5 pounds, so it could pull, theoretically, 3 of itself, plus itself, up a vertical incline. If you're coming from an RC car perspective, this may not be that impressive, but when you compare it to LEGO models, namely the official LEGO sets, you realise just how powerful, and better, this one is. It could pull 5 of the LEGO models in the other direction while climbing an incline. If this video does well, I could do an update to this one. Or if you've got any ideas to run this around, cool. But the next model is either going to be a plane, maybe, hasn't flown yet, but the math does check out, thrust, wing ratio, looking good, or an Object 279 with realistic suspension and a fully functional carousel autoloader that shall ejects. Maybe.